This series is brought to you by Lone Mountain Land Company, First Security Bank, and the Big Sky Chamber of Commerce. Hi, everybody, and welcome back to episode 4 in this 5-part Big Sky virtual town hall series. Yesterday, we caught up with Taylor Rose of the Bozeman Health Big Sky Medical Center, who reflected on his first year on the job during the COVID-19 pandemic. Today, I'm pleased to introduce Gary Rieschel, founding managing partner, with Qiming Venture Partners. Gary has joined us a couple of times on the show over the past year and brings a deep business background in venture capitalism in the healthcare industry. Gary, welcome back to the Big Sky Virtual Town Hall.
Thanks, Joseph. Good to be here.
So Gary, you joined Eric and myself on the show around this time last year. What were some of your thoughts then? And looking back, how did those play out over 2020?
So, unfortunately, I was right about some of the more pessimistic forecasts at the time. I think one of the comments on the technology was that we would have vaccines within a year, which turns out we were able to do that. I think it's also pretty clear at this point that another forecast on COVID being a permanent part of the landscape that's going to be the unfortunate part. I would expect everyone to be getting vaccinations, and then I'd expect us to require booster shots every year for whatever variants have come out during that period of time. So on the science side, I think it wasn't that it was clear, but it was clear that there were enough serious people putting resources together. And I think the different programs that the government put in place, the different cooperation among corporations, that was quite unprecedented, addressing a health crisis like this. Really, it got us to the point where we had vaccines, we had testing, we had more and more of a mask mandate later in the year, which that's probably the biggest disappointment, was not having had a harder, more abrupt shutdown early. Because if you'd asked me a year ago, I would not have expected us to have 500,000 deaths in the United States. So I think that truly, grossly exceeded my expectations. I think on the business side, pretty much it's, the things that I was worried about have happened. And so when you look in downtown Seattle now, hundreds of businesses that are not going to reopen. Some of the largest, most successful restaurateurs in the city have now permanently shut down their operations. There are very large landlords in downtown Seattle that are giving up 65% of their office space. They have already cut in half, from 45,000 in Amazon's case to 20-something thousand in terms of the expected workers back in the city, but they don't expect them to be there every day. So again, I think we're relatively early in understanding the economic consequences. The science, the healthcare consequences, I think we now have a decent handle on, but I still think we're coming to grips with what the real cost and economic consequences are.
Yeah, sure. Well, speak a little more about those economic consequences in terms of, what advice would you have for a small business owner now in Montana?
So again, I think what I last year when we were talking, and at the time there really wasn't any data for this, but I think the comment I made was that work will change permanently as a result of this. Education will change permanently as a result of this. The work side is now becoming pretty clear. Whether a company is asking people to come back by a particular point in time is almost immaterial, because companies have figured out how to make this work. And even in the case of some very high cost enterprise software products, other kinds of large capital goods, it's now okay to do at least a significant part of the entire sales process, design process, whatever process you want to pick, virtually. And that was not okay a year ago. And so that is no longer temporary. That's now a permanent part of the landscape. Education, it's okay to do education remotely. And I think that gives us an opportunity, frankly, because right now we have a hideous situation in the United States where, depending on your zip code, determines the quality of your education. That is disadvantaging minorities to an extraordinary degree. And if I was looking at how teaching should be done now, pick the 10 best teachers in the city, they teach, all the other teachers become tutors and help support students learning that material. It's not going to be okay anymore for us to have mediocre teachers teaching classes when 2 miles away there's a school with with great teachers that can actually do lectures and things online, and therefore then you can backfill and supplement with the in-person education. So I think both work and education are moving in a direction where they will not go. I hope education doesn't go back to the way it was. I hope we actually take advantage of this situation. For smaller businesses just have to be realistic. I think most of the businesses in Big Sky, many of them figured out how do you do takeout, how do you do delivery. They virtualized quite a bit of their operations. I think many of the restaurants became much better at forecasting their purchasing, forecasting their load management. I think they'll continue to need additional help. But what I was very gratified to see that the Marriott has done so phenomenally well. Very high occupancy rates, in the winter and spring. And so I'm pretty optimistic that many of the places in Big Sky kind of got it early and figured out what they need to do to survive. And the trends are all in their favor if they can get through the next 12 to 18 months or so.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah, there's been, a lot of surprises, and I think we're learning, hopefully, a lot of lessons. Gary, you spoke a little about the remote working, how education, but also the workplace are changing as a result of the pandemic and the ability to work virtually. The West has, saw an influx of domestic travelers last summer. We're seeing it still now this winter. Folks are moving to Montana. Do you see this changing at all as cities begin to open up again?
So I always laugh with the folks in Bozeman that call themselves or start to complain about Los Angeles, because number one, it's not anything close to that, and number two, you have to get over yourself and just accept that, Big Sky, whether it's the Yellowstone Club, Spanish Peaks, Big Sky, it's not going back to the way it was. This has now this area has gotten far more attention. Everything between Jackson Hole and Bozeman has become hot. And so you have a lot more money, you have a lot more people coming into the area. There's more pressure on the affordable housing. There's more pressure on the fringe communities as they're taking more and more people that are commuting longer distances. And I think this is just the reality of something we're going to have to live with. The planning commissions, hopefully, in Bozeman in particular, seems to be doing a much better job and on top of the development. And now we'll go through the other phase where quite a bit of things will get overbuilt, and you'll have developments that aren't going to be doing quite as well, and you'll have to grow into that. So I think that's natural. That's kind of the way that these things. That's at least my experience with different communities. But I don't see anything causing people to want less of Montana. And it's interesting, when I'm on the Nature Conservancy Board for Montana, I'm on the PERC board for Montana, both organizations had very good years in terms of fundraising, in terms of the achievements, the strategic planning processes the teams have gone through. So they actually benefited because the luxury last year was not a five-bedroom penthouse in New York. The luxury last year was being able to walk out your door and have 20 miles of trails. So it was the access, I won't say wilderness, but access to nature. Truly the luxury for 2020. And Montana, that's what Montana's all about.
Hard to give up that fresh mountain air.
Absolutely.
Yeah, go back to the city, it's difficult. Looking just ahead over the next few months, in terms of, events, in terms of travel, what does the summer look like to you?
Well, I think the summer here will be quite, popular, crowded. I think you could pick a number of different adjectives. The vaccination process in Montana is actually going pretty well, at least as far as I can tell. And I think Governor Gianforte has done a really good job of accelerating the availability to everybody. It's really important that as many people as possible, as quickly as possible, have the choice of getting that vaccine, or a vaccine. I think that the clubs will continue to have probably testing requirements, negative test requirements for access to amenities. I don't have great insight into what YC has decided or Big Sky has decided, but I expect the airlines to continue to be quite strict with some of the requirements. So I think the travel industry understands any bad news could be fatal to either a route or a hotel or a region, if you will. So I think everything from the national parks to the airlines, the airports, and so on will have a higher level of scrutiny, higher level of management in terms of trying to avoid being the place where there's a significant outbreak. So I think people will get comfortable. I mean, fly fishing is kind of a naturally social distanced activity. Golf can easily be, skiing obviously is, hiking, so I think a lot of the activities that people are going to normally would come to Montana for are going to be available and be, quite safe. So again, for this area, I think we're in pretty good shape. I think we're going to be in pretty good shape.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that's good news, for us here and for, the visitors who are looking to experience, Big Sky and the nature you speak of. Speaking of avoiding being the next big place where a breakout might occur, Qiming, your company has a number of companies that invest in the healthcare industry in China, where, of course, COVID-19 coronavirus was first discovered. How is China today?
So Qiming we have a U.S. operation. We have about 30 companies in the U.S. team, and we have several hundred in China. China actually did something that it would have been very hard for the U.S. to do this very aggressively early on, just shut down. Mm-hmm. And so they continue to have just pretty out there reactions to any concentration of cases. They'll immediately go test 3 or 4 million people in a city. They still have a mandatory 14-day quarantine on arrival. They're now starting to play some games where they're saying, well, if you don't have a Chinese vaccine, you're not going to be able to come in the country. So they're trying to promote their own vaccine diplomacy or their own vaccine usage, which I think is silly. But that gets into some political areas.
Sure.
China's domestic airline industry, domestic hotel industry has bounced back significantly. So my partners and team members in China are traveling 90% of what they were a year ago. But they're not traveling outside of China. Oh, right. So the Chinese aren't swarming the planet, and people aren't beating down the doors to get into China. And so I think the domestic side of China, of the Chinese economy, the domestic side of travel, leisure, et cetera, is doing very well and mostly recovered. The international side, that'll become increasingly political until there's some kind of standard for if you have this kind of vaccination, you have this kind of negative test, then you can bypass the quarantines. Until they start to get past the quarantines, international travel for the Chinese coming here or vice versa, because even if they come here and there's not as strict a quarantine, they at some point have to go home. Right. So they're simply people simply don't want to put up with more and more of that quarantine.
Interesting. That's really interesting. You spoke a little about the Chinese economy. You spoke a little about the U.S. economy as well. I wanted to ask you about a report that came out this morning, the Department of Labor reporting that unemployment claims fell to their lowest level since the start of the pandemic. How is the U.S. economy doing right now? And do you see any changes over the next 6 months?
So I think I'd like to say that it's optimistic and the economy is coming back, but I think we have to keep in mind there are a lot of people, particularly women, who have basically stepped out of the workforce and are no longer actively looking for jobs. because they typically have been hit much harder with staying at home, looking after kids that are being educated. The gig economy jobs, the part-time work jobs, oftentimes those don't show up in the labor statistics that you look at. Um, so I, so I think that the official statistics look good, but that doesn't mean we're out of the woods yet. We could have a separate discussion around 1.9 trillion, whether all that was necessary or not, since we hadn't even deployed a trillion of what had been granted before. So everything's but everything's being placed now in a bit of a political frame. I think just practically, there's still a lot of people that need support. Women, minorities were hit disproportionately during COVID. And so we clearly need to be doing more to bring them back. But I think the numbers are a little bit misleading now because I think a lot of people have just stepped out of the workforce for some period of time.
Yeah, providing what could be seen as a bit of a false sense of security, perhaps.
I think that for Montana, the key for the Bozeman, for this kind of southwest Montana area, and all the way over to Missoula and down to Wyoming and Idaho, the key is going to be what can we do to bring in one or two major business anchors. There's really nothing that's going to anchor Bozeman as if you could find another Oracle picking up a equivalent of Right Now Technologies, employing several hundred people, 500, 700, 1,000 people. We need a couple more of those in this region to really anchor the Bozeman area for the next decade. And when I mean anchor, it's a reliable tax base. You can do the planning because you know what your occupancy rates are likely to be in housing. You know what the school attendance rates are going to be. It's going to be very hard to do that with only smaller enterprises. So I think that Governor Gianforte and his team, I think they're spending quite a bit of time thinking about what would the right kind of anchor tenant be for this region. And so we'll have to see what happens with that.
Sure. Very interesting. Yeah. Well, Gary, thank you. Thank you for that. That's really interesting to hear about a larger anchor, industry or company, needing to move into the area. Anything else you'd like to share with viewers today?
Well, I think that if you're watching this, you're probably in Montana or thinking about coming to Montana. And I think you should feel comfortable coming and enjoying what the state has to offer. I think Montana's done quite a good job, and Big Sky in particular has done quite a good job with the testing, the contact tracing, and things. So I don't know really anyone in this community that I'm exposed to that isn't comfortable. People are still respectful. People are still wearing masks. They're doing what they should be doing. But I think people feel pretty optimistic about this, seeing light at the end of the tunnel now, for this area. And so, hopefully if that prediction is as accurate as some of the more unfortunate ones I had to make last year, then I'll feel really good if we do the same thing a year from now.
Well, I hope you're right. And I think everyone can probably agree with me on that one. Gary Rieschel is the founding managing partner with Qiming Venture Partners. Gary, thank you for your time and insight this evening. And thank you all for tuning in. I'm Joe O'Connor with EBS Newspaper, and this has been the fourth installment of the Big Sky Virtual Town Hall. Join us tomorrow when I sit down with Danny Bierschwell and Kevin Germain with the Big Sky Resort Area District. We'll see you then. Gary, thanks again so much for your time.
My pleasure.
This series is brought to you by Lone Mountain Land Company, First Security Bank, and the Big Sky Chamber of Commerce.